The best podcast, The Idlecast.
Again, the question isn't what God can do. People always say, well, you Reformed people are putting God in a box, but that's not true. In fact, we're known, if anybody knows what we actually teach and confess, to teach that God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful. He can do anything he wills that is in accordance with his nature. The question is not what God can do, but whether there are still apostles among us and whether the gifts as they existed in the apostolic period are still present. And the evidence for the continuationist case, both the biblical evidence and the empirical, is weak at best.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or its advertisers. Listener discretion is advised. Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. And now, Scott Clark.
He did not lower his standards to fit the company.
I can handle things, I'm smart. I like everybody says.
It's growing season out there, too.
Not for my hair.
Yeah.
I feel his pain. It's the Idlecast, the podcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian, and this episode is for the week beginning Sunday, July 7th, 2024. We're brought to you by the Heidelberg Reformation Association. We exist to recover the Reformed confession and to help others discover it. We're at heidelbergrefformationassociation.org. Email or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net.
At the tone, leave your name and message. I'll get back to you.
Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Don't forget to subscribe at Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Give us a 5-star rating in your pod app so that others can find the Heidelcast.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
This is part 20 in our series,
Feathers and all, the scriptures are enough.
and we've compiled a resource page at heidelblog.net/feathers. And that has everything you need for the series. It has a bibliography, a list of Heidelblog resources, and all the episodes for the series, which would be the previous 19 episodes. And it's also linked in the show notes for each of the shows in the series. And as always, you can find everything you need now it's official at heidelcast.org. We don't have a site set up for that yet, but when you click on that, or if you go to heidelcast.org, it will take you to the Heidelcast page, heidelblog.net/Heidelcast. Eventually, we'll have a page there with all of its own stuff. So remember, the big problem in Corinth was factions led by self-proclaimed hyper-apostles, super-apostles, theologians of glory, who opposed the apostles instituted by Christ, made fun of Paul because he suffered for the gospel. Talked about that last week. And in response to the arrogant, schismatic attitude and behavior of the hyper-apostles, Paul advocated the virtue and ethic of love. We're in 1 Corinthians 13, and this is our second episode on 1 Corinthians 13, and we're going to pick up in verse 9. But he's been characterizing hitherto in chapter 13 what love is, in distinction from the arrogance and lovelessness of the hyper-apostles. And so he's advocating, as I say, the virtue and ethic of love, which flows from union with Christ, true faith, new life. In other words, it flows from the saving grace of God. And in verses 9 through 10, and then again in verse 12, I'm going to lump those together, even though they're separated by verse 11. Those are thematically united, so I'm going to treat them together. Verses 9 and 10, and then verse 12. Paul sets love over against the over-realized eschatology of the super-apostles. That's a mouthful, over-realized eschatology. What that means is the hyper-apostles were promising more of the consummate state then can actually be realized in this life, in this age. We're not in the age to come yet. The age to come, according to the Apostle Paul, has been introduced by Christ. The kingdom of God has entered human history. The final state has entered human history, but it has not been fully realized yet. And the hyper-apostles were, in effect, saying that they had more of the consummate state, if you will, than the Apostle Paul. And that's part of the package of an over-realized eschatology, part of a theology of glory. That's one of the messages of the theologians of glory. And from my point of view, it seems like this is sort of baked into the charismatic, Pentecostal, continuationist movement, is this sort of over-realized eschatology, this theology of glory. And the hyper-apostles were saying, for example, to be specific relative to verses 9 and 10 and 12, or 9 through 10 and 12, they were saying, in effect, we know, when we have more complete knowledge than the Apostle Paul, and therefore we prophesy out of this more complete knowledge. Therefore, you should listen to us and not to Paul, because he's not very impressive. He doesn't have a glory. He doesn't have power. He's weak, and he even admits that he's weak. And so we went through this last time. If you're just joining the series, then go ahead and listen to the previous episode. Really, you should go back and start with part 1 so that you can understand how we got where we are. 1 Corinthians 13, second part of chapter 13.
Idlecast.
Paul says, for, from part, this is my sort of hyper-literal translation, for from part we know, and from part we prophesy. We can translate that in part we know, in part we prophesy. But I think it's interesting to capture the out of, the source idea, right? The preposition in the form of the noun that he uses indicates source. So it's out of a partial knowledge that he knows, and it's out of a partial knowledge that he prophesies, or that they in the first century in Corinth are prophesying and knowing. And then he contrasts the partial with something else. He says, then when the perfect comes, presumably in the eschaton, we'll talk about that, the thing from part, literally, again, this is a very sort of super, or maybe even artificially literal translation, just so you feel it, feel the text, let it hit you differently a little bit. Then the thing from part, or we could say whatever is partial, will be abolished. So there's a clear contrast here between that which is partial, which is temporary, which is going to be abolished, and that which is complete. Now, we don't know what is what yet and what it all means, and that's what we have to work through here. Calvin is helpful here. He says, let us observe, however, what Paul designs to prove, that the gifts in question are temporary. So that's interesting. Now, he's not really talking about cessationism there. I don't want to give a false impression. And I agree with what he says there, that they are temporary. But this doesn't, as I say, you can't really solve the question of whether the gifts continue out of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It's like being a man of, as Van Til says in another context, it's like being a man of water in water trying to claim a ladder of water. Right? You can't do it. And we have the same problem in 1 Corinthians. We're asking 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians maybe, but certainly 1 Corinthians to answer a question that it doesn't intend to answer. That is, are the gifts for today. They have to be, those questions have to be answered outside of 1 Corinthians on a broader basis, which I've already tried to do. And that's why if you're just joining this series, you need to go back and start at the beginning. But we can get a sense of what Paul, in his context, as he's writing to the Corinthians, as they're practicing the gifts, these apostolic gifts, we can get a sense of how Paul thinks about them and what his view of them is, how they were intended to function, and let them instruct us from their context to ours as we think about these things. So whether or not they continue after the apostles, regardless of that question, or the answer to that question, on their own terms, in 1 Corinthians, the charismata are temporary. Now, other things are temporary too. And what that means, as best I can understand, and Calvin, and I'm influenced too by Kim Riddlebarger's commentary has been helping me, and others. This is another way to say that they are not eschatological. In other words, they are provisional. They're for this age, but they're not for the consummate age. So that's maybe the big point in this part of the passage. The question is, how temporary? Right, and as I say, we can't really answer that from 1st and 2nd Corinthians because they were written to the churches in the apostolic age about the apostolic phenomena. They're not really intended to, in that sense, to explain to the post-apostolic age how this all works. So it's really important to make sure that you are asking questions of the text that the text itself intends to answer. Were the claims of charismata supported by undeniable, unquestioned, unambiguous evidence, as I think I've said before, we wouldn't be having the debate about whether they continue. But clearly, the empirical evidence, that is, the evidence from our sense experience, is not unambiguous. It's always somebody said, or someone said, to be grammatically correct, I heard, or I think, or I just believe that, right? Well, none of those really count as evidence. And this has been a problem that people have been noticing for a long time. And as I say, this debate goes back to the 16th century, and in some ways it goes back to the 2nd century. But one of the better modern treatments of this problem is B.B. Warfield's Counterfeit Miracles. If you haven't read that and you're really interested in this debate, I think you should read that volume. That helped me quite a lot as he goes through and deals with the claims of the Pentecostals and others, or Pentecostalists and others, about continuation of the apostolic gifts. And he raises a number of questions, and that's one of the questions that he raises. It was a pressing question in the 19th century, and as I say, it's an even more pressing question in a day in which almost all of us now carry in our pockets 4K cameras on our smartphones. So there should be an abundance of objective evidence as to the continuation of the apostolic gifts. Here is, apostle so-and-so being transported by the Holy Spirit, and we verify that this isn't AI or digital sleight of hand here. That should be easy. Here's a shadow of apostle so-and-so passing over ill people in a village where the gospel has not hitherto come, and here are all these people being healed. Here's a viper striking an apostle, and he's fine. It doesn't kill him. Here's an apostle raising people from the dead. Here are people speaking in languages that they didn't know. They were supernaturally empowered. Here's a supernaturally gifted person translating. They didn't know this language. They're simply translating it supernaturally, and all of that. That should be simple. And of course, all of that video footage doesn't exist, and that raises some fairly significant questions. That's what I mean by empirical evidence. So again, the question is not what God can do. People always say, well, you Reformed people put God in a box, and that's not true. We say God is omnipotent. He's all-powerful. He can do anything he wills that is in accordance with his nature. The question is whether there are still apostles among us, and whether the gifts as they existed in the apostolic period are still present. The evidence for the continuationist case, both biblical and empirical, is weak at best. Well, what is the perfect? The adjective here is teleion. And what is teleion? What does that mean? Calvin says, but when will that perfection come? It begins indeed at death, for then we put off along with the body many infirmities. but it will not be completely manifested until the day of judgment. So that you can see how he thinks about that. Well, how is it used in Scripture? Well, we could start at Romans 12:2, and be not conformed to this age, but be transformed in the renewal of your intellect. This is my translation. In order that you might judge what is the will of God, the good, the pleasing, and the perfect. So in that sense, perfect is a moral perfection. Is what in view there. James 1:4, let endurance have its ergon teleion. I think I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable before. It's teleion. Let endurance have its perfect work. And we could translate that. So I think that's how it's usually translated. In order that you might be teleioi, that you might be perfect and complete. And I think the parallel there between perfect and complete tells us what is really going on there. I think these are two ways of saying the same thing. Lacking in nothing. So that which is perfect has everything that belongs to it, as opposed to that which does not. And I think that seems fairly clear. 1 John 4:8, John says that perfect love casts out fear. So as opposed to imperfect. So that, and again, that which has everything that belongs to it. And in this standard New Testament dictionary, they refer us to Hebrews 9:11, which uses the comparative form. So in other words, the more than form. And it says, but when Christ appeared, and then it goes on to say, then the phrase is, then through the more perfect tent. So that eschatological tent, I suppose, something like that, referring to the ascension and priestly ministry of Christ, as opposed to the earthly, so the less perfect. So that's maybe that gives you a sense of what teleion might mean in our passage, that which has everything that belongs to it. And look too at Ephesians 4:13, reading from the English Standard Version, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood. And the adjective there is teleion, complete. And this is going to be relevant to the passage as we come to Paul's comparison between being a youth and being grown up, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ.
The best podcast, the Idlecast.
So it has two senses relative to this discussion, eschatological in a sense and mature. So eschatological is that which is consummate, which belongs to the heavenly realm. And mature is distinct from or in contrast to immature, undeveloped. Mature would be developed. In verses 9 and 10, what is in view is the eschatological. In verse 11, the comparison is between what is immature, undeveloped, and what is mature, developed. Kim Riddlebarger says, and I appreciate this, that the function of the gifts is to facilitate love. Quoting here, he says, the charismata are manifest only in this present age because of their equipping function. And this is, I think, important and interesting because in Corinth, the function of the gifts was practically, not by divine intent, but practically it was to display the power of the hyper-apostles and their followers. They perverted the nature and the function of the gifts. And again, this seems like it's still ongoing. The continuationist movement is in that respect, not in every respect. I don't mean to suggest that they're doing all the things that the Corinthians are doing. I don't mean that at all. But in this one respect, the continuationist movement is still far too often a Corinthian movement about a power and a conquest and glory in this life. Kim goes on to say, love has an abiding quality because it is characteristic of Christians, not only in this age, but also in the age to come when perfect love is finally manifest. And I like that very much. So love is, in a sense, injected into history as we experience it, this age, as Paul says, and it is the principle from the eschatological age. Faith becomes sight, hope is realized, but love just remains. And so of the three theological virtues, as the church has traditionally described them, has a different quality. By the way, it doesn't mean, and Calvin actually gets into this in his commentary, that the Roman Catholics are right that love is greater than faith relative to justification. Paul's not talking about justification here. Remember that the Roman Communion says that we're justified through love, is what they say, through a faith formed by love. It's not faith resting, receiving, and trusting. It's through faith insofar as it obeys, insofar as it is formed by love, made a reality by love, insofar as it is doing good works, etc. And so they've made faith into a virtue in justification. Now, we say faith is a virtue in sanctification. That's certainly true, and sanctification is a consequence of justification. And our Roman Catholic friends say no, justification is a consequence of sanctification. So bear that in mind. I thought Calvin's note there was kind of helpful. Verse 12 touches on this whole idea of incompleteness. So our knowledge, our prophecy, our sanctification, our understanding in this life is all partial. And he puts it very colorfully in verse 12. For now we see through, he says literally, we would say in English, in a mirror dimly. Right? It's not a window, it's a mirror. That seems pretty clear from the word, the usage, the history, etc. But then he says face to face. So now we see, we know, we understand in or through a mirror dimly. Enigmatically, we could say. That'd be almost a transliteration of the word that he uses. And, again, you have to be careful about adding up the letters of a Greek word and then reading them back into English and then reading the English usage back into the Greek. So that's a problem. You hear this. You hear preachers talking about the connection between dunamis, power, and dynamite. And of course, that's all nonsense. It doesn't work that way. It's like it's called the etymological fallacy. It's like the English word nice. It's etymologically related to the Latin word for stupid. So if you're going to, use the etymological fallacy, you could say, well, you shouldn't call people nice or cars nice or whatever. You shouldn't use nice because it means stupid. Well, people rarely mean stupid today when they say nice. So you can't determine necessarily the meaning of a word by its etymology. I get that. I'm just trying to help you understand something about the sense of the word maybe and give you some peg on which to hang some of this. And in this case, I think it sort of works. We see through a mirror enigmatically, and I'll come back to that in a second, dimly, that's a fair translation, but then when, well, in the eschaton, in the final state, we shall see face to face. And now he says, I know literally from, we would say in, part, but then in the eschaton, I will know as I am known. So, first of all, as I mentioned in passing, it's a mirror that Paul is discussing here and not a window. So the older translation glass is misleading. It makes people think in the modern period of a window pane through which you can see. And that's not what's in view here. The emphasis is on the relative obscurity of our source of knowledge and the limits on our ability to see, know, and understand in this life. The Reformed have been very good about this. Great Reformed theologian Franciscus Junius distinguished between theology as God knows it and theology as we know it. And I'm going to sort of roll out the technical language that he used. I'll try to explain it quickly. He distinguished between theology as God knows it and theology as we know it by describing the theology as God knows it as archetypal. And that's something that no creature, no mere creature can have. Not even, by the way, Christ in his human nature. I'll come back to that in a second. So no creature can have archetypal knowledge. So if you can know it, it's not archetypal. Right? That's what that means. That archetypal knowledge belongs only to God. Human beings, he said, Junius said, and he's drawing on lots of Protestant theologians, drawing on Calvin's language and on some medieval theologians. And he said the theology that we have is ectypal, and it's an analog is what it is. So an analog is not the thing. It's a copy of the thing, and it's accommodated, Calvin said, to our finitude. And then he went on, Junius did, to distinguish different kinds of ectypal theology. There's the theology that you and I have now in this life. He called that pilgrim theology. And then there's the theology of those who have gone to glory. It's still ectypal. It's still for creatures. It's still for humans. It's still only an analog of what God has. And he called that theology the theology of the blessed. So that's a slightly more elevated version of ectypal theology, but still ectypal, still analogical. We could never know what God knows the way he knows it. Our intellect never intersects with God's intellect. It's always parallel to God's intellect. Our understanding never intersects with God's. It's always parallel to. Why? Because we're not God. God's infinite. He knows everything as fully as it could be known from all eternity without any change and in a single instant, and that certainly isn't true of you and I. And this is just the difference between humans and the Creator. Right? God is. Moses said, "Who shall I say sent me?" God said, "Tell them, I am sent you." Right? That's not true of any creature. All creatures have a beginning and an end. So we can't say I am. We can say I exist now, but I haven't always existed, and when I die, I will return to dust. That's not true of God. And so that's what this is about. And then I mentioned in passing, the theology that Jesus has in his human nature, and he called that the theology of union. So it's, again, a more elevated type of ectypal theology, but it's not archetypal theology in his human nature, because he's true man and true God. One person, two natures. But there's a real distinction between the two natures. The deity doesn't deify the humanity, and the humanity doesn't humanize the deity. So, there's a little Christology here in our discussion of 1 Corinthians 13. So that's our way of accounting for these limits on knowledge. We could say, to try to understand what Paul is doing here, we could say that our knowledge is semi-eschatological.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563. We love to get your comments, and we read them on the air, but we especially love to hear from our donors. You know, those people who help bring you Heidel Media content. Paul writes, the Heidel blog and the Heidelcast are the best resources extant for both learning and understanding the Christian faith. Glad to see that you have expanded your footprint. Thanks, Paul, for doing your part to help make it possible. Brian writes, thank you for all the content you put out on the Heidel blog and Heidelcast, especially the latter, as I turn to it several times a week on my commute. I am blessed with more assurance than ever, in large part due to the content you put out. Thank you, Brian, for your encouragement, and thanks for your support. Help the Heidelcast help you and others. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Heidelcast. This is the Heidelcast.
The Heidelcast.
We were taught, in effect, that we are all Elijah, and we're all in 1 Kings 19:10. And for example, I'm thinking here of 1 Kings 19:12. Maybe back up a little bit, reading from the Authorized Version, because that's what everyone was quoting, and people still quote it this way. And he came thither, means to there, unto a cave, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and said unto him, what doest thou here, Elijah? And he, that's Elijah, said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, this is the Lord speaking, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore, the mountains, and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a still small voice. And so it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entering of the cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And it goes on. So we were taught, without any reference to the context, with the original intent, with what it actually meant when it was given, or what it means in the history of redemption, we were taught that we are, in effect, Elijah. And if we have enough faith, if we use the right technique, the Lord will speak to us in a still small voice. I don't know how many times I heard that, or at least portions of that passage read, but of course that's a complete abuse of that text. You and I are not Elijah. And, Elijah was being rebuked by the Lord. And Elijah wanted something powerful. He wanted the Lord to do something about his situation. I mean, he had a series of relatively legitimate complaints. That's a bad day at the office when you have to report, if you will, to the boss that people are killing your coworkers. I mean, I've been in parts of companies where we made jokes about Friday afternoon massacre. It was a figurative massacre. It just meant people got laid off or got fired. They didn't actually get killed, but of course some of the prophets really were being killed. So it's a rough job being a biblical prophet. I'm not making fun of Elijah's problem, and the Lord doesn't do anything big. He does something very, very small in a way. But it has nothing to do with you and I receiving continuing knowledge. But, lots of Christians have been taught, are being taught, will be taught. I was certainly taught that we can receive a direct revelation apart from Scripture, from the Holy Spirit, to answer specific questions that we have. Whom should I marry? Listen for a still small voice. What job should I take? Listen for a still small voice. Which car should I buy? Listen for a still small voice. And of course, if you're part of the prophecy movement, the continuing prophecy movement, we didn't have in our congregation back then people standing up and declaring themselves to be gifted with the gift of prophecy and then declaring sort of overtly continuing revelation. But we're all practicing a kind of soft continuing revelation. And so once you do that, if continuing revelation can happen, well, then why can't it happen at the prophetic level as opposed to the still small voice level? At any rate, the whole point of it then really is to learn things that you aren't really supposed to know from special revelation. You're supposed to, should I take this job or not take this job? Well, is it a legal job? Is it a moral job? Is it an ethical job? Is it a job that you can do? Does it fit with the vocation that you have before the Lord? Does it require you to violate the law of God? Does it require you, for example, to work on the Sabbath? Well, okay, is it a work of necessity? Policemen, physicians, surgeons, nurses, people who work in public works, those kinds of things. Maybe bus drivers. John Murray got in trouble for arguing that Christians could take the bus to church on the Sabbath. He actually had to change denominations over that issue. So I don't think it's liberal to say that maybe bus drivers have a function on the Sabbath, but there are certain necessary functions on the Sabbath. Selling clothes, probably not a necessary function on the Sabbath. Working in a fast food joint, probably not a necessary function. So we might disagree as to what those are, but that's the distinction that that we make. And so those are the kinds of questions you ask. You get wisdom. You talk to people whom you trust, people who have maybe more experience than you do. You pray for insight into yourself, into your situation, and within those parameters, you make the best decision that you can. We live in a world of partial knowledge, partial understanding, and we live in a world of limits. We don't live in a world where you can know directly from the Lord exactly what he thinks about everything that you want to do, could do, or should do.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
The contrast then is between the limits of our knowledge in this age and the more complete extent of our knowledge in the consummate state in the new heavens and the new earth. And so an over-realized eschatology, which is what the hyper-apostles have, which I think the continuationist movement has today, is trying to have consummate knowledge now, consummate faith, consummate power, consummate sanctification, which is, of course is what the doctrine of entire sanctification is about. You can't have entire sanctification in this life. Not according to the Apostle Paul in Romans 7. You can't have that. And so here, going back to the adverb that we translate dimly, which is related to our word enigmatically, it's used for riddles. For example, it seems quite likely that Paul here is alluding to Numbers 12, 6 through 8. And Scripture says, this is from the ESV, and he said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream." Now here's the contrast in verse 7. "Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him," verse 8, "I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So Moses was the greatest of all the prophets. He's sort of the prototype of the prophets in Deuteronomy 18. And he's superior to the other prophets. They get visions, they get dreams. Moses speaks face to face with God. He's faithful in all of God's house. Remember, although Hebrews says that Jesus is the owner of God's house, Moses is faithful, Jesus owns the house. And that's why we say Scripture is about Jesus, not about Moses, and that Moses works for Jesus is my sort of slogan way of putting that, axiomatic way of putting that. But you see that contrast. God speaks literally mouth to mouth or face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. And that is reflected in the Septuagint, and then Paul's probably picking up on that in 1 Corinthians 13. In the new heavens and the new earth, we will be face to face with God, as it were, and we won't be looking in a mirror, and we won't be dealing with riddles and a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. All of that will be resolved in the new heavens and the new earth, but not right now. Now is the time for muddling through. In a sense, you could say that that's one of the great differences between the Reformed and cessationists generally, but particularly the Reformed and the continuationists. They are not content, and they're part of a broader, older movement that is not content with muddling through in this age. They want perfection before perfection is here. Again, Calvin is helpful here, quoting, he says, "The ministry of the word, I say, is like a looking glass," we would say mirror, "for the angels have no need of preaching or other inferior helps, nor of sacraments, for they enjoy a vision of God of another kind." This is the Visio Dei, about which people wrote so much in the Middle Ages. "And God does not give them a view of his face merely in a mirror, but openly manifests himself as present with them. We, who have not as yet reached that great height, behold the image of God as it is presented before us in the Word, in the sacraments, and in fine," he means in summary, "in the whole of the service of the church." This vision here Paul speaks of as partaking of obscurity, not as though it were doubtful or delusive, he means leading to delusion, but because it is not so distinct as that which will be at last afforded on the final day. So maybe that's the big point in this episode to take away, from this passage and from the episode as a whole. is learning to be content in the in-between time, and learning to be content with what we call in the Reformed churches the due use of ordinary means. Continuationism is all about the extraordinary. Right? It's all about the super, the hyper, the better, the greater. And Paul says, you know what I have for you? I have the preaching of the law and the gospel. I have the sacraments. I have the story of Christ and the sort of ordinary, if you will, if you allow me to use that word, Christian faith. And we're not in the consummate state yet. So I do think, as I say, I don't think we can solve the problem of whether from 1 Corinthians and whether the gifts continue. But we can certainly see a contrast between the Montanists and, to the degree the continuationists partake of the same attitudes, same views, same theology, to the degree that, then there is a real contrast here. Then finally, verse 11, Paul draws a contrast between infancy and maturity. When I was a child, I was speaking as a child. Again, this is a very literal translation. I was thinking as a child. I was reasoning as a child. But when I became a man, I had put away childish things. And the implied contrast here is between infant or child, nepios, child, and teleios, an adult, a mature man. So we are not mature yet in Paul's scheme, the way he's thinking and writing and talking here. We will be in the new heavens and the new earth, but maturity leads away from childish things. The gifts belong to the age of immaturity. Love belongs to the mature. And that's really the contrast he's at here. The Corinthians, to put a fine point on it, have the gifts. They have power. They have prophecy. They have the ability to speak natural languages supernaturally, the ability to translate those natural languages supernaturally, the ability to heal. They have all these powerful gifts, but they lack a very simple virtue, and that's love. And that's what he says in verse 13. But now remains these three things: faith, hope, love. But the greatest of these is love. The greatest of them is not tongues or languages, speaking in known languages, natural languages supernaturally, the ability to translate known languages supernaturally, the ability or the gift of healing people supernaturally, the ability to speak a word of prophecy, some sort of direct revelation from the Lord to the Corinthian congregation supernaturally. Those things don't remain. And in fact, faith is the instrument through which we are justified, the only instrument through which we are justified. Also, in the Christian faith, it becomes a virtue as it becomes a habit, a disposition. We grow in our knowledge of God, our trust of God. Hope is a virtue that is formed in us as a consequence of justification. Love is a virtue that's formed in us as a consequence of justification. But the greatest of these is love. And we have to ask ourselves why that is. It's love that lasts. It is not the gifts that last. It's love that lasts. So faith in the act of justification, as I said, is not a virtue. In justification, Christ is the strength, the power, the virtue of faith. In sanctification, however, faith becomes a virtue as we mature, as God graciously leads us to becoming, as Paul says, a mature man.
The best podcast, the Idlecast.
Hope looks to the eschaton. It looks to the final state. Eschaton's just a technical word for the final state. It is, as Calvin says, faith persevering. That's what hope is. Faith hopes, and in sanctification, we grow in our appreciation for the consummate state. We long for it because we become increasingly aware of how little we know and how little we are what we shall be. And I think that's really important. Now, here's a distinction I'd like to draw between maybe some of the old school Pentecostals and more modern versions of continuationism. My sense of the old school Pentecostals was they were, in as much as they were part of the holiness movement, they were sort of heavenly minded, and they did look forward to the eschaton, and there wasn't maybe quite as much health and wealth and this worldly power and and this worldly glory and all of that you see in so much of the continuationist movement in our time. But hope is directed towards the final state, right? And so hope will be consummated. It will have that for which it looks, that which it anticipates. So faith will be sight, hope will be consummated, and love will be consummated too, but Scripture says it remains. In other words, it's final. It participates in heaven and in the final state in such a way that it, in a sense, isn't done away with. So again, Calvin, quoting here, he says, love extends its benefits to others. Faith and hope belong to a state of imperfection. Love will remain even in a state of perfection.
The story you have just heard was true. Only the names were changed to protect the innocent.
That's it for this episode of the Heidelcast. Join us next time as we continue our series,
Feathers and all, the Scriptures are enough.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Email heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563, or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When a coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2024. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
Without the creed, what are we? What do we stand for?
All right, that's it. Let's roll. Hey.
Let's be careful out there.
Good night, Chet.
Nothing is over until we decide it is. Silence! I kill you! I'm out of here!
We're a little late. Good night, Paul.
Oh, gracious, say good night.
Good night.
And good night, Mrs. Calabash. Well, Emmy.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building.
It's the end of the program. Roy Knapp is at the chimes. Good night, all. We'll be with you tomorrow.
Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Adjusting away that machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
The Animals and the Help Me Girl. That'll do it for the Larry McCormick Show today. I'll see you at 3 tomorrow. Jimmy O'Neill standing by to give you the full measure of the Lovin' Spoonful on KFWB Group W. Westinghouse Broadcasting for Los Angeles. It's 3 o'clock.
This is KFWB News. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Angel. A freighter which has been dismantled burst into flames today, and officials cleared a huge Navy shipyard, fearing an explosion from residue in the hull of the vessel's fuel tanks. More than 48,000 gallons of the fuel were reported to be aboard, but this later proved to be incorrect. The fire apparently began when a spark from a welder's torch ignited the residue left in the tank. An aircraft carrier in the Atlantic Coast dock being dismantled at the same pier was in danger of being set afire. Firemen cleared workers from the yard, but there was no report of injuries. A spokesman for the Coast Guard said the unidentified freighter was burning mainly in the fuel compartment, and an explosion was feared in a gasoline compartment located next to it. All ships in the vicinity of the burning vessel was ordered to steer clear. Water was poured onto the old freighter in an attempt to drown the fire. There are no SIG alerts in effect. KFWB News Time is 3:01. 2 electricians were injured today in a flash explosion on the 4th floor of a towering new City National Bank building downtown. They were working in an electrical vault when the main switch cable was short-circuited, causing an electrical flash which hurled the 2 men across the room. Other workers pulled the men away from the smoke-filled room. The victims, Robert Ibarra of Pico Rivera, was critically burned over the upper portion of his body. Jobin Jackson of San Gabriel was seriously burned. That floor of the new building was not occupied at the time of the explosion. It is now Saturday morning in Vietnam, and the second holiday ceasefire has now gone into effect. Its duration is 48 hours. U.S. troops have been ordered to be vigilant against any red violations, and extra police patrols are posted in the city of Saigon. American ground and air forces pulled back into defensive positions after delivering their final blows of the year against the enemy in North and South Vietnam. In the meantime, the administration has been urged by a group of 84 businessmen and the head of the Roman Catholic Peace Group to curb any escalation of the Vietnamese War. This in a letter to President Johnson. This while communist diplomats in London said Hanoi has little desire at this time to talk peace because worldwide opinion on U.S. policy seems to be in their favor. The Southland sniper, a suspect in Christmas Day murder. KFWB newsman Beach Rogers has that story.
A man suspected of being the motorist sniper who terrorized southwest suburban areas of Los Angeles is in custody and has been linked to the mystery slaying of a 19-year-old girl on Christmas Day. The girl, Barbara Jean Jones, was shot in the back and fatally wounded as she was leaving a house party early Christmas Day. Sheriff's detectives say the fatal bullet came from a .22 caliber automatic belonging to the sniper suspect, 26-year-old Peter Nick Toma Jr., an unemployed machinist's apprentice. Ballistics tests show that the same weapon that was used to kill Miss Jones also wounded 3 motorists early Wednesday. Toma was arrested after deputies observed an auto matching the description of the sniper's car near his home. He was booked on a charge of attempted murder, which was later changed to murder when he was linked to the slaying of Miss Jones. The sniper was described by some of his victims as a cool sharpshooter who fired repeatedly at them in the cases when he drew his car alongside other vehicles on the Harbor and San Diego Freeway. He also shot a pedestrian from Tulare early Wednesday. This is Beach Rogers, KFWB News.
The Texas White House declared today that anti-poverty programs have lifted some 8 million Americans out of the needy bracket since back in 1960, and President Johnson hopes to ease the burden of another 500,000 by next July. The chairman of the House subcommittee looking into the activities of Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell recommended that Powell's estranged wife be fired from her present high-pay federal job as Powell's special secretary. The job she currently holds pays more than $20,000 a year. The subcommittee has been investigating Powell's situation as a congressman for the past several weeks. 2 prisoners were wounded in traffic court this morning here in Los Angeles after one of them grabbed a deputy sheriff's revolver from its holster in an apparent effort to escape. Hit were Benjamin Castillo and William Wilson, both of Los Angeles, but they were not wounded seriously. Officers said Wilson and Castillo, held on traffic warrants, were lined up against a courtroom wall. Wilson allegedly grabbed the gun as the officer passed by. 3 shots were fired, one hitting Castillo in the right leg. The other hit the ceiling as everyone in the courtroom hit the floor. Wilson was wounded during the struggle when deputies tried to disarm him. Both wounded men were taken to Central Receiving Hospital. The closing Dow Jones stock averages 30 industrials down 0.83, 20 rails down 0.27, 15 utilities were down 0.61, 65 stock index was down 0.48. Sales today were 11.33 million shares. No smog prevails. Sunny tomorrow with high clouds and gusty winds. Warmer days, 61 degrees at Civic Center. This is Bill Angel, KFWB News.
And this is Jimmy O'Neill, KFWB Music, saying howdy, hi, everybody. Welcome into round 1 of Fun and Adventures, musically speaking. Throughout the afternoon hours till 6 tonight, you're on the go with J.O. The Lovin' Spoonful sing Full Measure.
The full measure of your giving.
I'm stopping now.
The best podcast, the Idlecast.